the fog-draped streets of 19th-century New Jersey, whispers traveled faster than the carriages rattling across the cobblestones. At the heart of these whispers stood a physician, a man educated, respected, and seemingly devoted to the promise of science. But behind his polished demeanor and carefully chosen words lay a secret that would eventually horrify the public. The doctor was selling human corpses. To his patients, he was a figure of authority and healing. To the medical schools scattered along the East Coast, he was a reliable supplier of what they craved most: bodies for dissection. And to the few who stumbled upon his true dealings, he was something far darker, a man who profited from the boundary between life and death. This story does not begin with violence, nor with a single spectacular crime. It begins instead with quiet suspicion, neighbors who noticed the strange deliveries made under cover of night. Gravediggers who swore that the earth they had carefully packed down was disturbed just days later. Families who mourned their loved ones, only to feel a chill when rumors suggested their grief had been stolen from them, their dead carried away for purposes never spoken aloud. In an era when faith and fear intertwined, when the sanctity of the grave was as much a spiritual comfort as it was a cultural expectation, the notion that a doctor sworn to preserve life would desecrate death itself was almost unthinkable. Almost. Imagine the candlelit halls of medical colleges in the 1870s. Students huddled over anatomy tables, scalpels in trembling hands, their faces half lit by flickering flames. These young men, eager to learn the hidden map of the body, whispered of the lengths their instructors went to obtain the cadavers that lay before them. Few dared ask questions. Few wanted to know whether the pale figure on the table had once been buried, mourned, and consecrated. For education demanded sacrifice, and in the shadows of progress, morality often bent until it broke. The doctor at the center of this tale exploited that silence. His profession granted him both authority and access. He knew where the dying lay, which families could not afford lavish burials, which communities lacked the means to guard their cemeteries at night. Each corpse was more than a body, it was currency. Behind closed doors, he negotiated with institutions that valued anatomy above ethics, and he delivered what they required. To some, he was indispensable. To others, unthinkably monstrous. But to himself? Perhaps he believed he was advancing science, a necessary hand in the march of progress. Or perhaps, more chilling still, he felt nothing at all. The tension in this story rests in what was hidden and what was revealed. Villagers who trusted their local physician began to notice inconsistencies. A doctor who seemed overly present in graveyards, appearing at hours when others had gone home. Funeral rites disturbed by odd absences, caskets that seemed lighter than they should. And then whispers hardened into accusations. The idea that someone within the respected ranks of medicine could so casually betray both his oath and his community was almost unbearable. Yet it spread like wildfire across taverns, newspapers, and church pews. We must also remember the broader context. This was a century when medicine still balanced on the edge of superstition and discovery. Germ theory was only just beginning to take hold. Bloodletting, laudanum, and opium tinctures filled the shelves of apothecaries. The line between healer and charlatan was thin, and trust was often a matter of reputation rather than proof. Against this backdrop, the doctor's secret dealings seemed at once scandalous and, to some, inevitable. How else could aspiring surgeons learn to heal without first dissecting the dead? How else could progress be purchased, if not with the silent bodies of those who no longer had a voice? Yet the darkness of this tale is not confined to logic or necessity. It lies in the details: the creak of a shovel in moonlit soil, the soft thud of a coffin lid pried open, the hushed voices of men carrying away what had been laid to rest. It lies in the faces of mothers who returned to the cemetery only to find disturbed earth where their children had been buried. It lies in the chilling realization that respectability can mask horror, that a man sworn to preserve life could profit so eagerly from death. As we step into this story, we do so not as distant observers, but as witnesses to a time when the pursuit of knowledge clashed violently with the sanctity of grief. This is not merely the account of one doctor's crimes, but a mirror reflecting the uneasy relationship between science and morality. Tonight we open the door to a world of shadows, where trust crumbles, graves are desecrated, and a physician's polished smile hides the most unsettling of trades. And as we listen, we must ask ourselves, where does progress end and desecration begin? To understand the scandal that unfolded in New Jersey in 1873, we must first step back into the world of 19th century America, a society straddling tradition and progress. Medicine, science, religion, and superstition existed side by side, often colliding in ways that exposed the tension between old beliefs and new ambitions. The story of a physician turned corpse seller could not have occurred in isolation. It was nurtured by the very conditions of the era, shaped by the needs of the medical profession, the cultural weight of death, and the anxieties of a community caught between reverence for the grave and hunger for scientific advancement. The 1870s were a time of upheaval. The Civil War had ended less than a decade earlier, leaving behind not only a fractured nation, but also a generation of men and women deeply familiar with death. Entire towns still bore the scars of conflict, fathers buried in unmarked fields, brothers lost to distant battlefields, families broken by the weight of absence. Death was not an abstraction. It lingered in every household, in every churchyard, in the quiet silences at dinner tables. This collective mourning made the sanctity of the grave all the more sacred. Cemeteries became hallowed ground, not only as places of rest but as symbols of survival. To disturb them was to attack the very heart of a community's fragile healing. At the same time, medicine was advancing in ways that demanded the body itself as a subject of study. Universities in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston were expanding their medical programs, eager to match the progress of Europe. Anatomy was the cornerstone of this education, and cadavers were its indispensable tools. Yet the supply of bodies was chronically short. Laws strictly limited the use of corpses to those of executed criminals, and even then, the number was pitiful compared to the growing need. For every class of students, dozens of bodies were required for practice, for repetition, for the harsh lessons of dissection. Without them, future doctors would remain ignorant of the very structures they sought to heal. This scarcity created a market dark, secretive, and immensely profitable. Men known as resurrectionists or body snatchers prowled graveyards under cover of night. They were feared and despised, often treated as outcasts, but their work fed the insatiable hunger of the medical establishment. What shocked the public most in the New Jersey scandal was not that corpses were stolen, but that a respected doctor himself might have played the role of trafficker. The distinction between a desperate grave robber and an educated physician should have been vast, yet in this case, it seemed terrifyingly thin. The cultural climate of New Jersey in the 1870s reflected both modern ambition and rural tradition. Towns like Newark, Trenton, and Jersey City were growing rapidly, industrial centers filled with factories, smoke, and the promise of employment. But beyond the city limits, communities still clung to agrarian rhythms. Church bells marked the passage of time. Funerals were community events. Families often cared for their dead at home before burial. In such settings, death was intimate. People washed and dressed their deceased loved ones, sat vigil through the night, and carried the body to its resting place by hand. To have that intimacy violated, to know that a body prepared and mourned by family might be stolen, was an almost unendurable betrayal. Religion amplified these fears. Protestant denominations dominated New Jersey's spiritual life, and the promise of resurrection at the end of days gave the grave its sacred character. Bodies were not simply shells discarded after death. They were vessels waiting for divine awakening. The idea that these vessels could be dissected, cut open by strangers, and discarded as refuse was blasphemous. Ministers thundered from pulpits about the sanctity of the grave, while newspapers stirred outrage by describing the grisly details of body theft. In this atmosphere, the doctor's actions became more than a personal scandal. They became an assault on the spiritual foundation of his community. There was also a cultural fascination with science that complicated the picture. The late 19th century was an age of discovery. Electricity, steam power, railroads, and telegraphs were transforming everyday life. The medical profession, too, presented itself as a force of progress, battling disease and ignorance. Many Americans wanted to trust in science, to believe that it could offer solutions to suffering. Yet they were also wary of its cold detachment. Science required dissection. It demanded a level of clinical curiosity that felt inhuman to those outside the profession. The scandal in New Jersey played directly into these fears, presenting the doctor as both a healer and a desecrator, a man who embodied the best and worst of scientific ambition. Newspapers of the era thrived on scandal, and corpse theft was a story that inflamed both curiosity and outrage. Accounts circulated of families who opened graves to find them empty, of medical students laughing nervously as they worked on bodies suspected of being stolen. Rumors often outpaced facts, creating an atmosphere where truth and exaggeration blurred. In this fertile soil, the accusations against the doctor grew quickly. Whether every detail was accurate or not mattered less than the collective impression that something had gone terribly wrong, that the line between medicine and crime had been crossed by someone who should have upheld it most fiercely. The social context extended beyond New Jersey itself. Across the United States, body-snatching scandals erupted in various forms, from grave robbing in Ohio to medical school raids in New York. Each incident chipped away at public trust in physicians, feeding the stereotype of doctors as men who valued knowledge over morality. The New Jersey case became part of this larger narrative, a symbol of how science's hunger for progress could consume the very humanity it claimed to serve. The doctor in question was not merely an individual. He became a figure onto whom society projected its deepest fears about medicine, mortality, and betrayal. Economically, too, the scandal revealed fractures. Wealthy families could afford mausoleums, iron gates, and elaborate protections for their dead. The poor could not. It was their graves, shallow and unguarded, that were most often targeted. In this way, corpse theft was also a crime of class. The bodies of the powerless served the education of the powerful. For communities already struggling with inequality, this was yet another sign that their dignity was expendable, even in death. The New Jersey physician's alleged role in this system highlighted how privilege and exploitation intersected, turning grief into another commodity to be traded. By the time the scandal reached its peak, the public saw not only a single doctor accused of horrifying deeds, but also a mirror reflecting the broader anxieties of the age. The sanctity of death, the march of science, the wounds of war, the inequalities of wealth all converged in the figure of a physician whose choices shattered the fragile trust between community and profession. To understand why this story resonated so deeply, we must remember that it was not merely about stolen corpses. It was about stolen peace, stolen trust, and stolen certainty in a world already trembling between the past and the future. It began with a grave that would not stay closed. In a small cemetery on the outskirts of Newark, a family returned to visit the resting place of their young daughter, only to find the soil unsettled. At first, they thought it was the work of animals. But when the caretaker pried open the coffin to check, the truth struck with horrifying clarity. The body was gone. There was no evidence of vandalism, no valuables missing, only the child herself, stolen from her eternal rest. Rumors quickly spread, and within days, whispers pointed toward an explanation darker than theft for trinkets. Someone was stealing the dead for purposes that could not be spoken aloud in polite company. The first incident would not be the last. In the months that followed, more families began to notice strange disturbances. Graves freshly dug appeared shallower than they should. Wooden coffins bore pry marks, as though wrenched open with tools. In some cases, mourners swore they saw shadowy figures moving among the tombstones at night, lanterns flickering in the mist. Fear grew, and with it came anger. Yet when suspicions were raised, authorities often shrugged. Law enforcement lacked clear statutes against body snatching, and many officials, quietly aware of the demands of medical colleges, looked the other way. It was a crime that lived in the margins, where outrage met silence. Soon, accusations began to take shape. Gravediggers, themselves sometimes complicit in these acts, spoke in hushed tones of a physician known to appear at cemeteries long after services had ended. He was polite, well-dressed, and paid generously for discretion. For many of the working poor, the money he offered outweighed their scruples. A night's labor could earn more than a week's wages. To dig, to lift, to carry it was dangerous and degrading. But in the shadows of economic despair, it was also survival. The doctor exploited this desperation, weaving himself into a network of men who would bring him what he required: the bodies of the newly buried. Each corpse had a price. Adults fetched more than children. Healthy bodies, unmarked by disease, commanded a premium. The doctor kept careful accounts, arranging for deliveries to medical schools in Philadelphia and New York. Under cover of darkness, wagons rattled along back roads, their grim cargo concealed beneath hay or barrels. For the medical colleges, the origins of the bodies were never questioned too deeply. Payment was made, dissection commenced, and students bent over their tables with scalpels in hand, never asking whose grief had been transformed into their lesson. But the human cost of these thefts was profound. One widow, visiting the grave of her husband only weeks after his burial, collapsed when she found the site desecrated. Her cries drew neighbors, and together they uncovered the horror. The coffin was empty, her husband's body taken. Her grief became a public wound, and her accusations ignited outrage. She named the doctor outright, swearing she had seen him lingering in the cemetery after the funeral. Others stepped forward with similar claims. Glimpses of his figure in the moonlight, wagons that departed his property at unusual hours, whispers of deals struck in the dead of night. The pieces began to align into a chilling portrait. Still, there were those who defended him. Colleagues insisted he was a man of science, dedicated to advancing medicine. Some argued that his actions, while distasteful, were necessary for progress. Without cadavers, how could surgeons learn their craft? How could physicians cure the living without first studying the dead? In this tension, the scandal deepened. To some, the doctor was a monster desecrating sacred ground. To others, he was a martyr to knowledge, forced into crime by outdated laws and societal hypocrisy. Then came the discovery that could no longer be ignored. A group of young boys exploring near the banks of the Passaic River stumbled upon a bundle wrapped in cloth. Curiosity turned to horror as they pulled it open to reveal the partial remains of a human body, discarded carelessly. The authorities, summoned in haste, traced the wrappings back to a supplier known to be in the doctor's employ. Confronted, the man confessed under pressure, naming the physician as the mastermind behind the trade. What had long been whispers and rumor now took on the weight of testimony. The investigation that followed peeled back layers of secrecy. Ledgers were uncovered, filled with coded entries that corresponded to bodies supplied and payments received. Notes described the condition of cadavers in clinical detail. Male, 30 years. Intact musculature, or female child. Cause of death, consumption. Each line was a life reduced to commodity, grief cataloged and sold. For the public, reading such accounts was unbearable. These were not anonymous cadavers. They were fathers, mothers, children stolen from their rest and bartered in the name of education. Incidents continued to surface even as the investigation proceeded. A churchyard in Jersey City reported multiple graves disturbed, the coffins pried open and emptied. In Patterson, mourners arriving for a burial discovered that another nearby grave had been desecrated only the night before. In each case, suspicions pointed back to the same physician, his shadow looming over every act of violation. Even when evidence was circumstantial, the pattern was undeniable. The community's unease transformed into fury, and yet the doctor himself remained composed. He denied direct involvement, framing himself as a victim of gossip and hysteria. He admitted to purchasing bodies for medical instruction, but insisted that these had been acquired legally from distant sources. He portrayed himself as a man caught in the crossfire between public sentiment and scientific necessity. But the evidence told another story. Witnesses placed him at cemeteries after dark. Receipts linked him to medical schools that admitted to receiving bodies through intermediaries. The weight of testimony pressed heavily against his polished defenses. As each revelation emerged, the incidents became more grotesque. Reports circulated of coffins filled with rocks to hide the absence of bodies, of grieving families lowering loved ones into the ground only to discover weeks later that the earth above had been disturbed. Lanterns were seen flickering among the gravestones at midnight, followed by the creak of wagon wheels disappearing into the distance. One particularly chilling account described the theft of a mother and child, buried together after dying in childbirth, their bodies taken as a single transaction. Such details haunted the public imagination, transforming outrage into horror. For the families affected, each incident was a violation beyond words. Mourning turned into anger, sorrow into distrust. Cemeteries hired guards to patrol through the night, and communities raised funds to build iron cages, so-called mort safes, to protect their dead. Some families resorted to standing vigil for weeks after a burial, sleeping among the tombstones with lanterns in hand, determined that no doctor, no grave robber, would steal their loved ones away. The very act of burying the dead became fraught with fear, the boundary between life and afterlife no longer secure. The cumulative effect of these incidents painted a grim picture. What had once been a respected physician now appeared as something far darker. A man who used his authority to profit from grief, who turned death into currency, who blurred the line between healer and desecrator. Each grave disturbed, each coffin emptied, each body sold became another piece of evidence, another stone in the wall of condemnation building against him. And as the scandal grew, the community braced itself for what would come next, a reckoning that would test not only the doctor's fate, but the fragile trust between science and society itself. When the truth of the scandal reached the public, the reaction was as explosive as it was divided. Families who had buried their loved ones now feared that the graves they visited held nothing but emptiness. In churchyards across New Jersey, whispers turned into open accusations, and quiet grief erupted into loud outrage. A physician had been trusted not only with the living, but with the dignity of the dead, and for many, this betrayal felt like an unforgivable wound. What began as suspicion transformed into a communal reckoning. The first and loudest response came from the families of the missing dead. Mothers wept openly at town meetings, telling of children buried with care only to be stolen in the night. Widows raised trembling hands in church gatherings, accusing the doctor by name, demanding justice for husbands whose remains had been taken. Their grief gave voice to a wider fear. If the sanctity of the grave could be violated by someone so respected, then who among them was safe? These testimonies spread through towns and villages, igniting outrage that echoed in sermons, tavern conversations, and on the front pages of local newspapers. Clergy members seized upon the scandal as evidence of moral decay. From pulpits, pastors thundered about the corruption of science when stripped of faith. They quoted scripture that spoke of the resurrection of the body, warning congregations that to tamper with the dead was to tamper with divine law itself. Many declared the doctor not merely a criminal, but an agent of blasphemy. The sight of parishioners gathering around cemeteries to guard the resting places of their loved ones became almost ritualistic, a vigil of defiance, lit by lanterns and fueled by fear. Faith and outrage became intertwined, casting the scandal as a battle between the sacred and the profane. Doctors and members of the medical community, however, responded in more complicated tones. Some condemned the physician outright, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. They spoke of ethics, of the necessity of respecting both the living and the dead, arguing that his actions threatened to drag the entire profession into disrepute. Yet others defended him in hushed voices, insisting that he was a scapegoat for a larger problem. Medical education demanded cadavers, and the law provided far too few. Was it truly a crime to supply what society's future health depended upon? These private defenses rarely reached the public, for to speak them aloud risked outrage. But within lecture halls and behind closed doors, many admitted that without men like him, their education would have been impossible. Newspapers fed on the scandal with hungry precision. Each issue brought new revelations, new testimonies, and new outrage. Illustrations showed shadowy figures carrying bodies from graves, and headlines accused the medical profession of desecrating the sacred. Journalists painted the physician as both villain and symptom villain for his personal greed, symptom of a broader system that demanded the dead be turned into tools of learning. Letters to editors reflected the division. Some demanded harsh punishment, even death, while others more cautiously urged the government to change the laws to prevent such crimes by providing a legal means of acquiring cadavers. The scandal thus sparked not only outrage but also debate, turning dinner tables and town squares into arenas for fierce discussion. Neighbors who once greeted the physician with respect now crossed the street to avoid him. Patients who had trusted his care turned away in disgust, whispering that his hands, once thought to heal, were now stained with desecration. His house became a site of both fascination and revulsion, with townsfolk gathering nearby to point, speculate, and condemn. Children dared one another to approach his doorstep, while their parents muttered curses under their breath. In this shifting tide of public opinion, his family too suffered. His wife, once seen as a woman of dignity, was now whispered about in the marketplace. His children, innocent of his actions, faced taunts and isolation at school. The scandal did not simply consume the man, it consumed all connected to him. Authorities struggled to respond. Grave robbing was a crime poorly defined in law, often punished only with fines, if at all. To prosecute a physician of standing required more than rumor, it demanded evidence that would hold in court. Yet public pressure mounted with such force that officials could not remain idle. Police were dispatched to patrol cemeteries, and judges began to hear testimonies that blurred the line between fact and rumor. Even when convictions proved difficult, the spectacle of investigation itself reassured the public that something was being done. But beneath the surface, many suspected that officials hesitated out of fear of alienating the medical establishment, whose support they often relied upon. This hesitation only deepened public distrust. Psychologists and social commentators of the time offered their own interpretations. Some framed the scandal as evidence of the thin line between progress and corruption. They argued that society demanded scientific advancement but recoiled at the cost it required. Others suggested that the physician himself might have been consumed by obsession, his pursuit of knowledge transforming into compulsion. To rob graves, to traffic in bodies, was not merely crime but pathology, a sickness of the mind, an erosion of empathy. In such interpretations, he became both villain and victim, a man undone by the very system he sought to serve. Communities responded with measures both practical and symbolic. Families pooled money to build protective cages around graves. Cemeteries hired guards, some even armed, to patrol through the night. New rituals emerged, relatives lingering at burial sites for days to ensure the ground remained undisturbed. Children sent to sleep with lanterns glowing in windows as a ward against shadowy figures. The dead, once thought to rest in peace, became the center of constant vigilance. Mourning transformed into suspicion, grief into a kind of restless watchfulness that weighed heavily on entire towns. The scandal also ignited legislative discussion. Politicians, responding to the uproar, debated whether the laws governing cadaver acquisition should be reformed. Some argued for anatomy acts like those in Britain, which permitted the use of unclaimed bodies from hospitals and poorhouses for medical study. Such laws, they claimed, would eliminate the need for grave robbing. Others resisted, fearing that these measures would disproportionately target the poor, turning poverty itself into a death sentence of indignity. In this way, the scandal forced society to confront not only the doctor's crimes, but the deeper inequities embedded in its medical system. For the ordinary citizen, however, these debates mattered less than the raw sense of betrayal. The physician's role was to preserve life, to comfort the grieving, to honor the dignity of those who had passed. By profiting from the dead, he had inverted this role, transforming healer into predator. This was the wound that lingered longest, not the practical question of medical education, but the personal horror of violated trust. In taverns, churches, and kitchens, the refrain was the same. If even a doctor could desecrate the dead, then what safety remained in the world? In the end, the community's reaction shaped the legacy of the scandal as much as the acts themselves. Outrage, grief, fear, and debate intertwined, leaving behind scars that endured long after the physician's fate was decided. Families built higher fences around cemeteries, churches spoke more loudly about the sanctity of the grave, and lawmakers began to draft the first real reforms addressing the needs of medical education. Yet the memory of the scandal never faded entirely. It lingered as a story told in hushed voices, a cautionary tale of what happens when trust is betrayed, when science loses sight of humanity, and when the hands of a healer become indistinguishable from those of a grave robber. The night that sealed the doctor's fate came like a storm breaking after a long, oppressive silence. For weeks, whispers had circled, accusations had grown louder, and the town's patience had thinned to threads. It was not one dramatic discovery, but the slow accumulation of unease, the gnawing suspicion that could no longer be ignored, that brought events to a head. By the summer of 1873, the community had reached a point of no return. The question was no longer whether the doctor was guilty, but how the truth would finally tear its way into the open. It began in the cemetery. Villagers had taken to guarding their dead, some keeping watch with lanterns and rifles, others sleeping on the very graves of their kin. One evening, as fog clung low to the ground and shadows stretched like phantoms, a group of watchers swore they saw a movement near the edge of the burial ground. They described a figure cloaked in darkness, dragging a sack heavy enough to leave grooves in the soil. By the time they gave chase, the figure had vanished, but the trail led not to the wilderness, not to the river as some expected, but in the direction of the physician's property. The rumor that followed spread like wildfire. The doctor had been caught in the act. Days later, a farmhand working on land adjacent to the doctor's home stumbled across something that turned gossip into certainty. Behind the physician's barn, beneath a pile of straw and discarded tools, lay a canvas sack. Inside were remains, bones stripped clean, their surfaces marked by the unmistakable cuts of dissection. The sheriff was summoned, and though some argued the evidence might have been planted, the sack became a symbol of undeniable proof. Within hours, townsfolk were gathering outside the doctor's house, torches flaring in the dusk, voices rising in chants of anger and betrayal. The air carried not only smoke, but the weight of centuries-old fears, that the grave, the most sacred of resting places, had been desecrated by a man they once trusted. The doctor himself, when confronted, did not cower. Witnesses later recalled him standing in the doorway, his face pale yet resolute, as if bracing himself against a tide that could not be stopped. Some claimed he tried to speak, to argue that his work served science, that progress demanded sacrifices no one wanted to acknowledge. Others swore he only looked down at the ground, silent, as though surrendering to the inevitability of judgment. The mob outside grew restless, shoving at one another, calling for justice not in courts, but on the spot. It was only the arrival of armed deputies that kept the crowd from storming his home that night. When the doctor was finally brought before the authorities, the proceedings carried the weight of a spectacle. The courtroom overflowed, every bench packed, every aisle crowded with neighbors, grieving families, and curious onlookers. Journalists scribbled furiously, their headlines already forming in ink. The air smelled of sweat and tension. The murmurs of the audience, a constant reminder that this was not just a trial, but a communal purge. The physician sat in the dock, his reputation stripped, his once respected name now spoken only with disgust. He appeared thinner than before, his hands trembling as he adjusted his spectacles, his voice unsteady when he spoke. Yet his words, when they came, carried a strange conviction. He admitted to supplying corpses to medical schools, but insisted he had never killed, never murdered, never desecrated with cruelty. He claimed he was answering a demand created not by greed but by society itself. "Do you wish your physicians ignorant of the human body?" he asked. "Would you rather bury your dead in darkness and superstition, or allow them to serve the living through knowledge?" His argument hung in the air, sharp, uncomfortable, and for a fleeting moment it struck at the conscience of some who listened. But then the voices of grieving families rose, and with them the sharp reminder that his words could not erase the pain of open graves, of broken trust. The testimony of witnesses painted a picture far darker than his defense. Farmers recounted seeing wagons late at night, their wheels muffled with cloth. Gravediggers told of bribes offered to look the other way. One man, his voice shaking, described exhuming the resting place of his own child, only to find the coffin empty, the earth disturbed. Each word deepened the wound, turning suspicion into vivid communal horror. The image of the physician as healer dissolved completely, replaced by the figure of a predator moving through shadows, feeding on the sanctity of death itself. The climax of the trial arrived with the presentation of physical evidence. The sack discovered behind the barn was brought forward, its contents displayed not in gruesome detail, but with enough clarity to confirm the truth. These were not relics of a distant time, not bones bought from medical suppliers abroad, but the freshly disturbed remains of townsfolk. The markings of dissection left no doubt of their purpose. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, women covered their mouths, men muttered curses under their breath. Even the judge's gavel could not quell the eruption of outrage. At that moment, the physician's fate was sealed not by the letter of the law, but by the raw tide of public condemnation. Outside the courthouse, the mob waited. As news spread of the evidence, chants began anew, voices rising like a storm. Some called for prison, others for hanging, still others for exile. The sheriff and his deputies formed a protective line to escort the doctor, but even under guard, stones were thrown, curses spat. The people demanded blood for blood, dignity for dignity. The physician, shielded by men with rifles, walked with his head lowered, his once proud stride reduced to a shuffling path through a corridor of hatred. He did not look up, perhaps unable to face the eyes of those who once trusted him. What made the climax so devastating was not simply the spectacle of a man brought low, but the way it mirrored the fears of an entire community. Here was proof that the institutions they relied upon, medicine, science, authority, could betray them. Here was the embodiment of their suspicion that progress carried a hidden cost, paid in shadows and silence. The courtroom became a stage where the clash between knowledge and morality played out in raw, unflinching detail. And though the verdict mattered legally, the real judgment had already been passed in the hearts of the people. In the weeks that followed, the scandal reached beyond the borders of New Jersey. Newspapers across the country reported the case, turning the doctor into a symbol of medical greed and moral corruption. Preachers in distant states used his name as a warning, urging congregations to guard both body and soul against the encroachment of godless science. Medical schools found themselves under scrutiny, their students eyed with suspicion, their lectures interrupted by protests. The physician's fall had become more than personal, it was national, a dark parable of ambition gone astray. Yet the climax was not only public, but deeply intimate. Families returned to their cemeteries, some digging up coffins to confirm their loved ones remained within, others erecting iron cages around graves as barriers against future theft. Mothers whispered apologies to the dead. Fathers vowed vengeance in their hearts. Children stared with wide eyes at the places where silence had been broken. The sense of safety once offered by a burial ground was gone, replaced by vigilance and fear. In every disturbed grave, they saw not just bones, but the violation of their community's very soul. For the physician, the climax marked the end of his double life. Once he had walked confidently between two worlds, the respectable face of a healer by day, the secret supplier of cadavers by night. That fragile balance had shattered, leaving him exposed, condemned, and alone. Whatever sentence the court would deliver, whether prison, fines, or exile, it was the judgment of his community that weighed most heavily. He had become a ghost while still alive, a man outcast, his name a curse whispered in taverns and churches alike. His legacy was no longer that of a doctor, but of a grave robber, a man who sold the dignity of the dead for coin. Thus the climax of the story was not a single act, but a crescendo of fear, outrage, and revelation, a storm in which an entire community rose against one of its own. The physician's downfall was complete, his reputation destroyed, his future obliterated. And yet, in the silence that followed, deeper questions lingered. Was he truly a monster acting alone, or a symptom of a society unwilling to face the truth about the cost of progress? In those unanswered questions lay the haunting power of the tale, ensuring it would echo through generations as more than scandal, but as a chilling reflection of human frailty, ambition, and betrayal. When the trial ended and the doctor was led away, the town did not erupt in relief but in silence. For all the noise, the shouting, the outrage of the climax, what lingered afterward was an emptiness, a quiet unease that could not be dispelled by verdicts or prison walls. People looked at their cemeteries with new eyes, suspicious of shadows even in daylight. The earth itself seemed unreliable, no longer a guarantor of rest, but a surface that might conceal secrets, or worse, betray them. For the doctor, his punishment was severe, though accounts differ. Some reports claimed he was sentenced to years of imprisonment, his medical license revoked, his fortune drained by legal fees. Others whispered that he never served a full sentence, that connections and wealth allowed him to vanish into obscurity, perhaps under a new name, perhaps in another state where no one knew his past. In the absence of certainty, stories grew. A few claimed to have seen him wandering country roads years later, gaunt and broken, still muttering about the necessity of sacrifice for science. To others, he became more myth than man, a specter haunting lecture halls and graveyards, a warning more than a memory. The community he left behind bore scars deeper than any courtroom could measure. Families who had lost track of their loved ones' remains never fully healed. Their grief was complicated, twisted into a cruel shape, not only mourning the dead, but mourning the desecration of death itself. Parents kept children away from graveyards, churches held longer vigils, and tombstones became symbols not just of remembrance, but of defiance. In some towns across America, the scandal prompted changes: iron cages over graves, heavier coffins, stricter cemetery laws. The resurrectionist era of medicine, once whispered about in hushed tones, now had a face, and his story had traveled far beyond New Jersey. What remains most haunting, though, is not the doctor's guilt or innocence, but the questions he forced people to confront. Was he truly an aberration, a lone predator of the dead? Or was he only the visible figure of a system that demanded bodies for dissection, knowledge for progress, while turning a blind eye to how that need was filled? Medical schools of the era were ravenous for cadavers. Some purchased them quietly, asking no questions about origins. Others relied on the unspoken truth that grave robbing was part of the cost of advancement. The doctor, in this light, was not only a villain, but a reflection of a moral compromise that stretched far beyond his own doorstep. It is in this ambiguity that his legacy lingers. The physician is remembered as both a cautionary tale and a symptom of a wider problem: the uneasy relationship between science and morality, between progress and the dignity of the human body. The Victorians lived in a world straddling superstition and discovery, and the doctor's story became one of the points where those tensions collided violently. In some ways, the outrage of the public was not only for the disturbed graves, but for the reminder that medicine itself, so often held as noble and pure, could have a shadow side, hidden behind closed doors. Years later, when people spoke of him, their words carried the tone of ghost stories rather than court records. Children in New Jersey were told to behave, or the doctor who stole corpses would come for them in the night. Travelers passing through whispered about the ruined house where he once lived, its windows boarded, its garden overgrown, its walls echoing with the phantom footsteps of a man who walked both sides of the grave. Farmers claimed that on misty nights, the sound of wagon wheels could still be heard creaking down forgotten roads. The faint metallic clatter of surgical tools carried in the dark. Historians, of course, tried to separate fact from folklore. They argued that while the details may have been exaggerated, the larger truths were undeniable. The scandal forced reforms in the medical field, spurred debates in state legislatures, and shaped the public's relationship with doctors for generations. Some even credited the episode with accelerating the acceptance of body donation programs, a more ethical answer to the needs of medical science. In this way, the doctor's fall from grace indirectly contributed to progress, though in a twisted, tragic fashion, and yet the mystery persists. Did he die in prison, forgotten and broken, or did he escape to continue his trade elsewhere? Was he a mastermind of desecration, or merely one link in a chain of demand and supply? The records are incomplete, the truth fragmented. That uncertainty has kept his story alive, not as a neat morality play with a clear ending, but as an open wound in history. Every unanswered question acts like a loose thread, pulling at the fabric of trust between communities and the institutions that serve them. For those who lived through it, the scandal was not just about a man, but about the fragility of boundaries between life and death, trust and betrayal, progress and violation. The doctor may be gone, his name fading from official ledgers, but his shadow lingers in every uneasy glance cast at a graveyard after dark, in every whisper about what sacrifices are hidden behind the shining facade of advancement. Even today, in old New Jersey cemeteries, there are tales told by caretakers. They speak of disturbed earth, of lantern light that flickers without flame, of figures seen at the edge of fog, pulling heavy sacks into the night. Whether ghost or echo of memory, these stories keep the doctor alive, not as a man of flesh, but as a legend carved into the darker margins of history. He is remembered not because he was singular, but because he symbolized something larger, the way human ambition, cloaked in respectability, can trespass against the very sanctity of death. In the end, the story of the doctor who sold human corpses is not only about horror or crime. It is about us, about the ways we grapple with fear, knowledge, and morality. It is a reminder that history's darkest figures often walk closest to our most revered institutions, their shadows lengthening across time, their lessons waiting for us to notice. And as long as graves remain, and as long as progress demands something of us, the question will linger like a chill on the night air. How far are we willing to go? And what price are we willing to pay for the promise of knowledge?